Sophia Henry, and I am a member of the Youth Empowerment Society of Summit, which is a branch of Communities That Care. And today we are doing an interview with Dr. Marion Smith Jr., who is the new superintendent for the Summit School District, one of our prominent leaders in the community that we're hoping to connect with the community members between these leaders. So Dr. Smith, thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you very much for having me, Sophia.
So we'll get started with the first question, and that is, what are the most important things to you about working in a rural resort community, specifically the impact of tourism on the local youth?
No, I appreciate that question. And so I'd like to say that I come to Summit from a different type and larger scale resort community. And so I was born and raised and began my education career in Las Vegas, Nevada. And so for those of us that know about Las Vegas, it's a city that averages over about 40 million visitors each year. And so I have a bit of context, but as I begin my second month living and working here in Summit County, I would say like what's becoming top of mind for me is really deepening my understanding around just the unique challenges and opportunities that are found in this type of community. Some of them have being our second homeowners and how to really leverage those second homeowners and those that may not have children in our school district for them to get extremely involved. Others that are standing out to me or things that are surfacing for me in just my first month is that most of the employment available is typically lower paying, and it can be difficult for our workers to really afford living actually in the county. I see that with challenges of recruiting and retaining just a consistent workforce due to just our seasonal nature of the economy. Other things that have surfaced for me just in my first month here is really around like the power of connections and really being visible and accessible. But if I think about the impacts of tourism and living in a rural community on just our youngest scholars and even teens and just younger youth, I would say from an economic perspective, we know that tourism really generates wealth and jobs. But then that also equates to our community, as I said a little bit earlier, the jobs are mainly low income. From a socio-cultural perspective, we know that our tourism brings in a variety of different people from backgrounds and cultures and traditions. And one of the things that I'm learning in the county right now is how we're grappling with how to address some of those differences in socioeconomic background, in religion and cultures, and what that really looks like. So I would say those are some of the things that have surfaced for me just in my few short weeks, actually 4 weeks living in the county.
That's very insightful, and I'd say those are some profound observations for being here for such a short time. And I look forward to how kind of that understanding will progress. And our second question is, what are your thoughts about Summit School District employing local sheriff office personnel in the middle and high school as resource officers?
Sure. I would say that initially to speak to this in detail without all of the data would be irresponsible for me, but I like to say that I need multiple data sources to really inform my thinking and next steps. But what I can speak to is that most of us may be aware that following the murder of George Floyd and nationwide protest against police brutality and racial injustice, there's been a growing call across the country to either defund the police, to reallocate budgets for law enforcement, and even to dismantle police departments completely. So these ongoing calls also extend to school resource officers. And so to provide a little bit of context, some school districts have already announced that they're making some changes and terminating contracts with the local police department. In Minneapolis, the city where George Floyd was killed, they voted to terminate its contract with the local police department. In Portland, Oregon, the school district superintendent communicated that he would be discontinuing just the regular presence of SROs in the state's largest school district there. And in one of my previous school districts, Seattle Public Schools, the superintendent there said that they'll suspend their relationship with the police for over 1 year. And so when I think about that, I think about prior to my time in the district, but even Upon arriving to the district last month, I reviewed quite a few key contracts and some MOUs, so those are memorandums of understanding, and one of them was our current agreement with our county sheriff's office. And this month, I have an initial meeting with Sheriff Fitzsimmons, and so I'm excited to talk a little bit about what that looks like and how to move the work forward. But I'm also mindful that our Board of Education leadership has expressed to me that it plans to review our school police practices. They're going to be reviewing some data about the SRO in our schools, and then they're going to make this a topic of a future board meeting so that we can engage in a larger community-wide conversation so that we're able to identify next steps. And so I would say to the larger community, stay tuned because there's more to come on this.
Wonderful. That was very informational. And I agree, without the data, it's hard to speak on a topic like that. But thank you very much. So our third question is, how will you prioritize collaboration with local health agencies in order to support the physical and mental health of our students?
Top of mind question right now. And so our scholars our scholars cannot learn until they feel that they are cared for, that they have a safe environment to learn in, and that adults actually see them, hear them, and they have the actual resources that they need to succeed. And so fortunately, the district has a strong relationship and partnerships already with a variety of local health agencies. And as the new superintendent, I want to leverage this and build upon it. I've started a few initial conversations with local health providers, and those conversations I've been explicitly calling out and naming what we see as possible key resources needed for this upcoming school year. Adding to that, like, two key priorities surfaced for us as a district when we began to develop our return to learn plan. So priority number one was around providing continuing support to our scholars and our adults to address their immediate and long-term physical, psychological, social, and emotional needs. And I like to say that without question, social and emotional learning has emerged as a critical priority, because when we think about March and the start of the global health pandemic of COVID-19, without question, we've all been impacted by this pandemic, but just in different ways. So as we've been thinking about as a district how to address some of those pandemic-induced realities or the pandemic-induced trauma, we've been focusing on how to work with our local health providers to target those additional supports. Priority number two was really around ensuring that all of our schools are trauma-informed and trauma-skilled. And so working with our local health professionals to really deal with or to address some of the professional development and professional learning that's going to be necessary to ensure that everyone in the district really understands the long-term effects of various types of trauma, whether that's physical trauma, psychological trauma, mental trauma, relational trauma, and even just trauma from the pandemic, as I said a little bit earlier. So we're going to continue to review our policies and practices and build the staff capacity to address what this trauma looks like in all of its different forms. And what that could actually look like in our schools is early warning intervention systems, wellness checks between staff and our scholars on a weekly basis, creating affinity groups for chats, and just building that wraparound support. And so I'm continuing those conversations with our local health providers, using some of the data from the past spring to inform some of the decisions that we need to make, so that we create that infrastructure that allows for all of our scholars to feel that they have the resources that they need, they have someone that they can turn to, and that we've created and built in them an opportunity for them to have the tools that they need in order to make some solid decisions as to mental health and the support that they need.
Great, thank you very much. It's definitely a hot topic right now, as you mentioned. So our fourth question is, Summit County is home to a large immigrant and underserved population, especially in our schools. How will you, as a superintendent, utilize inclusivity and equity when working to ensure academic services and resources are available to these students and their families?
No, I appreciate that question, Sophia. So as a critical race theory scholar practitioner and someone who has led transformative work in this area or in the areas of diversity, equity, inclusion, and educational justice, I've come to understand that before we can actually begin to address the issues, we must have a common understanding of the work and a calibrated definition of what these terms actually mean and what they look like in real time, in real action. And so my initial work is really around revisiting how we as a district distribute and allocate those resources across all of our different schools, what data we're actually using to inform these decisions, and then to be able to work with my team to develop what we call a weighted staffing formula or a weighted resource allocation model to address the identified needs in each of our schools, with an understanding that what is needed at the high school may look a little bit different than what's needed at our middle school. And when we think about all of the diverse needs of our elementary schools, that calling out Dillon Valley and saying there may be additional resources in terms of personnel, in terms of curriculum instruction, that looks a little bit different than a Breck-El. And so being able to surface that and have that be top of mind in our conversations. But I would also add that based on what I've learned, that resource allocation has to move away from equality, meaning everyone and every school receives the same thing, and really towards that equity component, meaning that everyone and every school gets what they actually need in order to make sure that all of our scholars are successful. And so I think that's going to be a shift in practice for our system as we move forward. To support me in this work, I would say I believe that those who are directly impacted by the inequities being discussed need to actually be at the table. And so for the start of this school year, I'll be implementing what I call a families or a parents advisory group to the superintendent. And that's going to be an opportunity where family members, parents are convened with me at least one time a month to just share, so I can actually listen and learn and then take action based on what I'm actually hearing. And I'm going to be prioritizing the initial family parent advisory groups to specifically work with our immigrant and Spanish speaking families, because oftentimes, just based on data and based on what I'm learning about the community, there may be an element of being disenfranchised or marginalized from the system. Not everyone has met success with the educational system, and not everyone feels like they're a part of our system. And so it's one of my goals as the new superintendent to make sure that all of the voices of our families and our scholars are at the table. And so starting to create that opportunity by having that advisory group to the superintendent, where I'll be meeting in the community. So I'm not going to be asking family members to come to the district office. I'll be going out to where community members are to engage in those conversations.
That's definitely very exciting, and I hope that we can have those conversations in person with COVID-19 is the goal, and that's definitely very exciting, and I look forward to seeing what kind of progress can come from getting everyone's voice at the table. So our last question for this interview is, what opportunities exist for high school students to advocate for their own education and provide a youth voice regarding decisions that are being made about them? And how can this involvement spread into the younger students to foster advocacy and civic responsibility at a younger age?
Sure. I like to say that our sole responsibility as educators is to focus on educating the learning and teaching of all of our scholars. And so some of you may be aware that 2 weeks after starting in my role as superintendent, I convened and participated in one virtual town hall that was specifically for our scholars to hear directly from them about what went well during spring remote learning, what did not go well, and what was one hope that they had for the upcoming school year. I'd like to spotlight that as just one example of how important scholar voice is to me. Our scholars are the ones who are impacted directly and the most by every decision that we make as a district. And so to that end, it is a non-negotiable for me that I create opportunities for all of our scholars at all levels in the district to use their voices to be part of the decision-making process of the district. And so some of you may or may not have noticed that on my 100-day entry plan that's available on our district website, I've outlined different outreach strategies to engage all of our scholars. So one example that I'll spotlight here is the creation of a scholar advisory council to the superintendent. So very similar to that parent family advisory. And so this particular group of scholars will meet with me at least one time each quarter so that they can share their perspectives, to provide feedback on action items, and to speak to what's actually working, what's not working, and what we should be doing as a district to best serve and support them. And so this is just one opportunity, and that'll be extended at the middle school and high school level. And then I'll be creating a modified version of what that would look like at our elementary level to make sure that I'm capturing the youngest voices as well. And so one opportunity among many where it's an open door policy. I really want to know how the policies that we're implementing, how the learning and teaching practices that your teachers are moving forward is directly impacting all of you. And so it's critically important for me that I create the space and the time and the platform for those conversations to happen. And so I look forward to starting that Scholar Advisory Council initially, and then having more conversations around what other methods we can use to make sure that I'm capturing the voices of those who are directly impacted by a lot of the decisions that we make as a district.
Great. That also sounds very, very exciting. And thank you for your time today. I definitely think those were some very informational responses to some of the tough questions in our community right now. And I, as a student, look forward to other opportunities to engage with the school board. And thank you again for your time today.
All right, thank you very much, Sophia. I appreciate it.